With 2020 giving us our first-time male Grand Slam champion in 6 years, as well as finally giving us a major champion that wasn't in their 30s, you would think that this was finally the year that those young fellows broke down that barrier that was the Big Three. That Grand Slam title was of course clinched by Dominic Thiem. However, add to that Daniil Medvedev bringing in another Masters title, as well as one of the best runs at the World Tour Finals we've ever seen. Sasha Zverev, the flag bearer of the next gen for the longest time, finally breaking through in the majors by making a semi-final in Australia as well as a final in New York. Stefanos Tsitsipas having a very impressive Roland Garros that ended in a 5th set loss to Novak Djokovic. Andrei Rublev having his breakthrough season as well as being the model of consistency all year. Denis Shapovalov having his best year yet. His compatriot Felix Auger-Aliassime making 3 more finals this year. The teenage sensation Jannik Sinner winning his first title and making a quarter-final run at the French Open. All of these results would lead you to believe that the young fellas really made inroads on the Big Three this year. But you look back on this season and you look at a lot of those guys I listed and their whole seasons in the big picture, and they had pretty mediocre years. Of course, that's not to say some of them didn't actually have some fantastic seasons, but I'm not sure they're quite ready to take that mantle from the Big Three, at least in 2021. To me, it was a step in the right direction and they made a lot of inroads. However, I think they're still at that knocking at the door phase rather than pushing the Big Three out the door. So, big surprise, in this video I'm going to be recapping the seasons of some of the biggest figures of that heralded next gen, as well as the newly minted Grand Slam champion in Dominic Thiem. You don't need me to tell you Dominic Thiem had a great 2020. That US Open title, Australian Open, and World Tour Finals finalist appearances kind of speak for themselves. Those 3 tournaments are kind of the basis of Dominic Thiem's A for 2020. Winning that World Tour Finals definitely would have given him an A+, and had he won it, you could make a compelling case that Dominic Thiem was the player of the year in 2020, period. Still though, it was a banner year for Thiem in capturing his maiden major and continuing his significant progress as a threat on hard courts. You look at his season as a whole and it was sort of a mixed bag, but at the biggest and most important tournaments, Thiem showed up and showed out in all of them. With this season, I think it's time to retire that Prince of Clay name for Dominic Thiem. If anything, at this point, he's the Prince of Hardcourt as the reigning Australian Open finalist, US Open champion, 2-time reigning World Tour Finals finalist. And with his most recent showings against Nadal and Djokovic on the biggest hardcourt tournaments in the world, you could argue that he has the highest peak level right now on tour on a hardcourt, which is crazy to think because as late as the fall of 2019, I think that Thiem was still perceived as that clay specialist who had his days when he redlined on a hardcourt, but was still extremely inconsistent and unpredictable off of clay. A lot of people kept looking at when is the year that Rafa Nadal is finally going to slow down for Dominic Thiem to take advantage and take the French Open away from him. But in the meantime, it kind of got overlooked, the threat that Dominic Thiem was beginning to become on a hard court more and more frequently. His progress really culminated this year when straight off the bat he took Rafa Nadal out at the Australian Open for his first win over him at a major, and then was on the brink of handing Novak Djokovic his first finals loss at the Australian Open in his career. And I think that tournament really drove home what a legitimate threat Dominic Thiem had become, especially on a hard court, to these big 3 guys, considering that they're at their mid to late 30s while he is now really at the prime years of his career. Plus, that Australian Open proved not to be fluky as he continued to be a big factor in the few major hardcourt tournaments that were played this year, Like last time we saw him, he actually went all the way when beating Nadal and Djokovic at the World Tour Finals. So with all that being said, you would think that heading into 2021, Dominic Thiem is going to be number one at some point next year. Dominic Thiem is going to capture at least one, maybe two majors next year, right? Yep, this is where I jump off the Dominic Thiem bandwagon. Based off finally getting that monkey off his back with his maiden major, as well as being so impressive the last time we saw him at the World Tour Finals, I've been seeing a lot of people say that they have high hopes for Thiem. I think Patrick McEnroe, right after that semifinal or final, said that at some point in 2021, he sees Dominic Thiem being the world number one. And I just don't see it, man. Not next year. Like, let me just break it down from the standpoint of number one, as well as the standpoint that he's going to win a major or majors next year. As far as from a number one standpoint, I've said it before that I still trust Nadal and Djokovic at this point in their careers to Dominic Thiem's, or anybody else's for that matter, and Dominic Thiem is the best that anybody that's younger than the big three really has to offer. But still, you look down at his matches this year and he still had a couple of horrendous losses, like the one in Rio, or albeit it was his first match back off the restart, but he got blown out by Krajinovic in Cincinnati. A couple of not so great losses for the world number 3 in ATP Cup. But you just don't see losses like that from Nadal and Djokovic, and even Federer. When we last saw him, you don't see them taking losses like that, at least not very often. And Dominic Thiem still had his fair share of those this year in what can be considered a career season. That obviously adds up with how long this tennis season is. And I just don't see Thiem being able to keep up with those guys over the course of a full year as far as consistently performing on a week-to-week basis. And you saw the Herculean effort it took out of Andy Murray at the end of 2016 to lock down that first number one since 2003 that was someone outside of those big three. And if Dominic Thiem is able to come back with even Murray consistency, or Murray in his prime consistency next year, then yes, that is certainly within range. But at this point, the fact is, I don't think you can say he even has Murray consistency. I do think that him winning a slam next year is more feasible out of the two, but this is really my first hot take out of my outlooks for 2021. I said Djokovic and Nadal were going to win their pet slams again for one more year. Nothing really bold there. But I don't think Dominic Thiem is winning a slam next year. And my rationale for that is really just because I feel like Dominic Thiem has come up small in his big finals throughout his career. Thiem has now been in 3 Masters finals, 4 Grand Slam finals, and 2 finals of the World Tour Finals. For the most part, I have been unimpressed with Dominic Thiem's showings in those finals. Whether it's the occasion getting to him, like his first final at the French in 2018 and even this year's US Open final, or fatigue kicking in, like I think this year's Australian Open final, as well as the final at the O2 this year. I just don't see how this trend is conducive to Thiem winning future slams in the near future. And when you look at him being fatigued in some of those finals, Thiem does himself no favors at the beginning of tournaments by being prone to playing up and down to his competition. So often at the beginning of tournaments, you see Dominic Thiem expending unnecessary energy and playing down to lesser opponents, resulting in him having to work harder than he should. And in more normal circumstances, he's going to have to play 1, maybe 2 members of the big three, barring they just fall off a cliff next year with form or health. But having to deal with that at the tail end, I just don't think it's sustainable for him to be expending that much unnecessary energy. Yet really, aside from this year's US Open, I can't think of the last time Dominic Thiem just cruised his way into the latter stages of a slam. And you saw even then, he really needed every bit of that energy he conserved in that final against Zverev. This isn't to discredit his US Open win or put an asterisk on it, but those were unique circumstances where you had two guys of the big three out of the draw, and you had another one of them be disqualified on a freak accident. For the next year, I don't expect any slam draw to be opened up like that, and while Thiem certainly has the capability to beat all of the big three, that's the part where he plays up to his competition. He's become really comfortable with facing those legends of the game. I can't really think of the last time he's laid an egg against them, but next year he's probably going to have to beat them in succession to win a slam again, and if he isn't able to be more efficient at the beginning of slams, I just don't see him adding to his count next year. And even if he's able to find his way to a final where he's not playing one of the big three, I don't know if I can completely trust him, just because the effect that his nerves seem to take on him in big finals versus non-big three members. At the end of the day though, this video is supposed to focus on 2020, and as far as that was concerned, Dominic Thiem excelled this season. Very close to an A+ season in my view. It was really nice to see him get his first major under his belt. He was a deserving champion after all those finals he lost. And it was really nice to see all his hard work that went back from when he was such a raw prospect that only looked to be suited to clay courts finally come to fruition with his first major title. So yeah, truly a banner year for Dominic Thiem in 2020. So after that long segment on Dominic Thiem, I'm going to do a bit of a rapid fire on some of the biggest names and top ranked players among the next gen and how they fared in 2020. Up first, Daniil Medvedev, B-. For most of this year, it would have been a good bit lower than a B-, but he really salvaged his season in the last month with Paris and the World Tour Finals. Prior to that, this year was really a sophomore slump for Medvedev after breaking out last season. The adjusted ranking system is really the only reason why he finished this year 4, and for the most part, he had a pretty down year, and even had he just won Paris, this still probably would have been in the C range, but his run at the World Tour Finals was probably one of the all-time great runs we've seen at that tournament, beating the world number 1, 2, and 3 with Djokovic, Nadal, and Thiem to win the title. It was the first we'd really seen of that machine Daniil Medvedev we'd seen last summer, and only really had seen it this year at ATP Cup, and then never seen again till Paris. Now, over the past couple years, we have seen a couple of younger guys taking out some of the bigger titles at the end of the year, and they've been kind of misleading in our expectations for them over the next year, but I've been a believer in Daniil Medvedev. I think that he's here to stay, and that those results from the end of this year are really encouraging, and that he will be able to somewhat carry that momentum into the next year, unlike Dimitrov in 2017 or Khachanov in 2018. He hasn't really proven himself in the majors outside of the US Open. I would look for that to change, and I feel that it will next year. I feel that he has great chances in Australia and even Wimbledon as far as making a deep run. US Open, he's already proven himself to be a threat. But yeah, pretty brutal year for Medvedev up until the very end. However, I would consider the way that he finished very encouraging, and I think it'll set him up for a much better 2021. That brings us to Stefanos Tsitsipas, who also had a very underwhelming 2020. His year is really another example of why a lot of people don't really buy into success at the end of the year from these younger guys, because he won the World Tour Finals last year in spectacular fashion. It seemed to be a springboard to greater things in 2020. And really from the get-go, Tsitsipas was not great this year. Looked to be in a bit of a funk early, but was seeming to snap out of it prior to the tour being halted. He came back, had a nice run in Cincinnati, and then just a catastrophic loss at the US Open, an absolute meltdown. After having a pretty wide open path to the semis, at least quarters, sort of melted down again in the Hamburg final going into the French Open, where he was able to have his best tournament of his year. Made the semis and was really making things interesting against Djokovic, coming back from 2-0 down before his legs gave out in the 5th. But then proceeded to halt his own momentum in the fall, where he again underwhelmed. I'm sure he'll have a better 2021 than he did 2020. He has all the tools, but I really came away from 2020 with more questions about the mental aspect with Tsitsipas, because some of those losses, obviously with Coric at the US Open and then Rublev in the Hamburg final, even the way he imploded in the middle of the second set, really out of nowhere against Djokovic in that French Open semi. You just wonder if some of those mental hiccups are going to hold him back, even when his game picks up, which I believe it will more consistently next year. But for this season, C-. And that brings us to Alexander Zverev. There was a whole lot of poor play from Zverev throughout this year that was reminiscent of his awful 2019 season. But more importantly, he did finally make some inroads in majors, which he hadn't been really able to do at all prior to this year. Already before that US Open, made the semis in Australia and lost a tight match to Thiem. And I don't think that he would have made the US Open had Tsitsipas not melted down against Coric. His play leading up to the final was really not very good. He did well to scrap through multiple matches, but the way he was playing really wasn't up to the caliber of a Slam finalist. That is until the final though, and I think that nobody really picking him because he was playing so poorly and Thiem playing so well on the way to the finals really allowed him to free up, and he was quickly up 2 sets and a break. And even though he lost that match, I think it was a valuable experience for him. Didn't play great after that in Paris at the French Open, but after that, I would say that the fall indoor season was the best that he played all year. He played great to win back-to-back, albeit 250 titles in Cologne, and had a really nice run to the finals of Paris. All in all, I think you'd have to say that Zverev trended upwards this year and heading into next year, finally breaking his woes in slams to some extent, regardless of the circumstances, has to be a confidence boost. And bringing David Ferrer onto his team as a coach already yielded great results. So I am giving Sasha Zverev's 2020 a B. And last but not least, Andrei Rublev. Obviously, Rublev was 2020's most improved player and took a giant leap forward in the rankings in a shortened season, which made it all the more impressive. Won a bunch of titles, I believe 5 at 500 or lower level, and was even able to make 2 quarterfinals at majors at the US Open and French Open. It's really hard not to give Rublev an A, but I will go B+ just because I still think that he's a weight class down from all the guys that I've mentioned prior when they play their best, as well as, of course, the big 3. Rublev is a workhorse, so he might find a way to work his way up to that level, but I do have questions about his ceiling just because I see some holes in his game, but I didn't think that he would have the breakout year that he would this year, so who knows. That pretty much wraps up my recap for Thiem and the young fellas and how they fared in 2020. A lot of the biggest stories out of this year came out of these guys, so even though a lot of them didn't have tremendous years, collectively these younger guys took further steps in dethroning the big three, even though the last hurdle in the slams still remains to be cleared and still belongs to the big three heading into 2021. But it'll be intriguing to see if they can continue their progress in the last 2 years and finally take the reins from that trinity. Of course, all that remains to be written, but if y'all enjoyed the video, please like, comment, and sub. I appreciate you guys for watching, and I will see y'all on the next one.